Right.
That's one of my favorite passages, Steve. I just love that passage in Job.
Right.
Maybe, Jim, you could just give us a brief explanation of why you love it.
Well, you know, the idea of a public servant. If any of you, you don't often see them, but here's a person who had all kinds of wealth and looking back could be dreaming of all the things he lost. And what he most is thinking about is the position he had, you know, of uplift and elegance. Why? Because he was seeking to do justice to those in need, etc. I don't know if any of you heard any of the eulogy time with this representative from Atlanta who recently died, one of the great civil rights warriors. But at that time, there was one of the comments, eulogies, was from his deputy chief of staff, a young woman who'd been with him a long time. And just the way she spoke about what he did, how he did it, how he treated them. You know, he believed the gospel, he preached the gospel, and he lived that out. It's really quite powerful. Anyway, so Job reminds me of that, and I hold it up against every time I see, you know, the opposite, which is an awful lot of the time.
Well, it's also challenging the idea that the term bureaucrat's a swear word.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I mean, it's actually talking about a very noble vocation.
Well, and even we still have the language in the U.S., I'm sure you do elsewhere, a public servant. That's what they are.
Yeah.
But the idea of serving the public is not the primary thing that comes to people's mind, particularly if they have a dislike for government.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we have a question that I've sent to you. I hope I've sent it to you.
Yes, I have it. Thank you.
From Eliel in Mexico. Do we want that put up on the screen, Steve, or?
Yeah, I'm just trying to sort it. I'm having
Okay.
a few problems. Sorry.
That's all right. Maybe Eliel could say a few words in association with what he's told us, if he wants to say any more. Are you there?
Yeah. Good morning.
Hello.
Hi, hello everyone. Well, my English is not very well. I am using a translator for understand better the conference or the words. And yeah, my question is about some critical theme in Mexico right now. As I said last week, and I'm not sure that the problem or the discussion is setting in the right direction. In my email, I said that the state is seen as the authority, competent authority for resolve this problem. So my question is really the state, the authority that must resolve this problem in our society, as in every society where the abortion is now in debate.
Jim?
Yes, it's a very good question, and it gets at some of the fundamental things about who bears what responsibility. Let me just preface the response by saying Roy emphasized the authority side of what sphere sovereignty, that is, who has authority. And in many ways, you're asking the question, who has authority competent authority to deal with something like this. I prefer to emphasize, instead of start with the authority or the sphere of sovereignty, with the nature of human responsibilities. So I would do a responsibilities framing side by side with Roy's. And what I mean by that is God has given humans many kinds of responsibility. We didn't know how many there were, I mean, from the beginning. But as human society developed, as life went on, we discover more and more things. Somebody can start producing music. Pretty soon people are doing all kinds of different things with farming and so on. Pretty soon we have not just somebody playing a reed, but whole symphony orchestras. We have all kinds of publications on and on and on, which are part of the development of society. And it's very difficult, I think, for many people to think in terms of who has chief authority. But what we need to do is to ask, what kind of responsibilities do we have? And my favorite question is, who's responsible for what? Well, if you start there and then you come to your question, why is it we assume that governments have some responsibility or should have some responsibility for something like abortion? Well, it's chiefly because, I won't go into a political theory lecture, it's chiefly because government has the responsibility for life and death issues. It's the one to protect people from illegitimate harm, as well as, when it's justified, using force, compelling people to pay taxes or compelling them to do this, and if necessary, in very dire circumstances, to use the force of a police force with guns or a military in a justified warfare setting. It would be impossible. I mean, these are many of the wars. I mean, you know anything about history, the many, many wars, civil wars that were fought for decades and decades over who's going to control what. Finally, you can have a society that's open if it's clear who has what authority and what they're there for. But while that may be the reason why we would turn to government with questions about life-taking or life protection, that is not, in answer to your basic question, the government does not have all responsibility for everyone's bodies or for everything. So if you ask the question, who's responsible for what? Well, surely the people that bring a child into the world, but before that, gestating in the woman's womb, they have responsibility. They had responsibility to bring it on, and they have responsibility now. And that's a responsibility in a larger context. So, and then there are others. I mean, extended families and other institutions, medical people, and so on. And then the interrelationship of those is the key question. So I think when it comes to the question of abortion and many others, we have to look at the whole context of it. One of my criticisms of the way the debate usually goes, at least in the United States, and I think in other places, is it boils down to either the woman or the unborn child who has rights. And if the woman has certain rights, she doesn't have a right to the unborn, to do anything with the unborn child. I'd rather look at it in terms of individual adults have responsibility, but in this case, a marriage, a family has responsibility, and the circumstances that are there. And if you take that back a step, then it would be to say, if government's primary responsibility is to uphold life, to protect life, to make it possible for life to go on, whether that's in terms of funding some medical care or other ways, it certainly ought to be protecting and doing everything to facilitate the life of families, because that's where the life producing comes. That's when the children are born. So the way I would look at it from a public legal point of view is not just whether the government has responsibility to either affirm or deny abortion. It would be to say, what are the circumstances the government is involved in that are to protect life, particularly the life of institutions like families, and the other schools and whatnot, that are not under the original jurisdiction of government. In other words, I don't see families as an extension of the political community, such that government has authority over all other authorities. It isn't a hierarchy of that kind of chief authority. But if you come to many of the societies that are developed, including the United States, and you say, is the government facilitating where it should those aspects of life that make it possible for families, particularly poor families, to have life? And if there's not regular health care, if there's not the government produces the health care, but to assure that their people have access. If it isn't doing the things like education, that there's job opportunities to facilitate that, not that the government offers all jobs, then that's also part of what goes on. And of course, in some cases, part of what produced the whole campaign of women for a right to abortion was the degree to which the threats to their own lives, I mean, the misuse of women, leaving them there, impregnating them, men impregnating them, and then saying, well, you bear responsibility. That's part of the origin of the need. It's not all of it, but part of the origin of abortion. So the way, I'm not going to get into the details, but the way I would approach then the question, is there ever a time when an abortion can be legitimate? And the way I would approach that is a little bit the way I would approach any question of the use of force. And the easiest way to think of it is justifiable warfare. Warfare should never be attempted. One shouldn't even get at it if there's any other option. Warfare doesn't guarantee anything at the other end. It's basically destructive. But there are times when, because of the onslaught of an attack from the outside that's going to disrupt the very possibility, to defend against that can be justified. It doesn't mean that that's a wonderful thing. You don't say, boy, the greatest thing for humans to have is to be able to go to war. No. But to defend. The same with police. The last thing they should do is use a deadly force in any way if they can avoid it. So it's to promote life. But are those circumstances? And of course, the obvious one that most people can accede to is danger to the life of the mother. Here's a life against life. What do you do? Well, and then there are things like, in my own mind, the illegitimacy of a young girl, particularly a minor, impregnated by a father or brother illegitimately, or a rape. There's an attack on a whole life for the future of life. Are there circumstances early on after that one could justify abortion? And it's at that point that what I would want in public law is laws that take into account and, let's say, draw borders around what you need to do to exercise your responsibility. Young woman, young couple, family, older person, see a doctor, consult with family, whatever, that what comes through is an assessment of what your need is. Anyway, that goes on into the details, but just to say there are many different kinds of people responsible for child care, child rearing, child breeding, generation. And the government does have a concern, a primary concern about life and health of everybody in the community, and that's where the issue comes up.
Thanks very much. Eliel, have you got any reply to that?
No, thanks for the answer. Yes, there is different arguments, but in Mexico, for example, there are arguments, medical arguments, ethical arguments, many different arguments. But finally, the state or the government is the judge that will establish or to define the final word, no, in this matter. My other question is how could different all of these different responsibilities could be integrated or articulated to bring an answer for this critical issue. How the responsibility of women, families, state, church, and many other social communities must participate in this problem.
Well, that's an excellent question too, and that would take a long time. Basically, my response would be one does need a just state and a high level of just government to actually recognize and take into account these other responsibilities of other parties. Instead of just turning it into a simple public legal thing, do we protect the woman and let them have abortion whenever they want? Do we say abortion on demand? Do we say, no, there may be no abortions? We don't care about any circumstances. That means a state, a liberal tradition. Mexico has a good bit of that as well as the United States. Liberal tradition just looks at the individuals in the government. That's basically what they're looking at. And the rest is just free play. I think there's where our diversified society, a recognition of God giving many kinds of responsibilities, and many of them are institutional, organizational, communal, that a just state has to recognize that. And if you don't have it, then simply the give and take, the back and forth of various powers will indeed lead the government to make a decision. I think it needs to make decisions about this, but what could be very bad if it doesn't take into account the full context.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Jim Skillen.
Thanks very much.
Probably an N instead of a T.
Eliel, is it Eliel? Is that how we pronounce your name?
Eliel.
Eliel. Yeah.
Eliel, yes. Yes,
that's
thank
good.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's probing. Your questions are also probing and beginning to, in my mind, raise the question of a Christian political movement that would articulate these and educate these perspectives that Jim is talking about in some kind of coherent way, so that it's not just pressure tactics from churches banding together and saying one thing or another, but that there is a concerted effort to serve our neighbours with a perspective that brings these things together. I mean, we Christians have got a task of also helping people understand the problem, and the problem of the way in which abortion is generated as a public debate is not very helpful. Mike's question is how Jim would respond to the increasing loss of civil society. In many situations, it's either the government, state, or the individual. This seems to be a suboptimal situation in which to handle such difficult questions.
And I'll repeat what I just said from this point of view. That's why we need a different view, a particular view of society in which we recognize that human beings have norms, God-given obligations, but they are normative and no one can escape them, whether they recognize God or not. We have these capabilities, responsibilities, and we have to respond to them as to whether we will love a neighbor, whether we will do justice, whether we will be good stewards. And that's what many of the arguments are over. But if you have a society which, as in the United States, is just highly built on maximum freedom for the individual and whatever government can do to aid individual freedom. And at either end of that spectrum, you have the libertarians who say that government should do nothing but protect against the misuse of force, protect life and property. And the other end that says, look, there's a whole bunch of things government should do to aid people so they can be more free. But that doesn't allow for my key question, who's responsible for what? And if people are poor, if they're hungry, if they're ill-fed, if some are getting too rich because they were able to lobby enough, which is the case in the United States, where the laws actually reflect a primary benefit to corporations and to the wealthy, because it's presumed their spending and making good decisions will help spur an economy. And an economy then is a means to other people to have more freedom. So if you have that kind of framework, it's nearly impossible to have an adequate civil society buildup or civil society strength. It's obviously very much worse in some countries that have not had even the degrees of freedom and institutional development. Some of the former communist countries, some newer developing countries that hardly have governments, maybe don't have judicial systems, etc. So it's very, very difficult, but I would say that's the value and the reason for asking about how do we relate these many institutions to each other, and recognizing the importance of a public legal order where governments can protect the innocent against the sharp edge of those who will get what they want. And some do it by force, but in many cases, it's just the power of legislation, the power of lobbying. So I think that's the dilemma, and that leads then into the argument of what to do. Let me give just one illustration. After Lyndon Johnson came to power in government, to president in the 60s, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and the civil rights movement was going, that was when he led the progressive cause that we're going to not only overcome racism, we're going to overcome poverty. So the government set out from a federal level to ask, how could we solve poverty? First question they asked is, how do we measure who's poor? So they came up with a bunch of figures to figure out how you measure the poor. Once they got that line, this low income, this blah, 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 they then said, okay, if you're below that line, you're poor. So the definition of poverty was below this line, poor people. And then they set about programs to try to get people above that line. Well, it doesn't take much. I mean, I would hope that in the kind of community that we are participating in, one would see, well, people may be poor for many different reasons. Besides that, they're not just either poor or not poor. They're people. They have families. They have characteristics of older and younger. They have characteristics of education or needing education, etc. So anyway, the government started building programs. Only later, when it became a battle, because the conservatives, the libertarians in this end, don't want government to do too much of that kind of thing. A bunch of people who recognized, which should have been seen on the billboards before that, recognized that, look, the reason we don't have more poverty is because all kinds of nonprofit organizations, from churches, and most of them are religious, Christian, Jewish, and others, are working very hard to help people who need the kind of help that they need. So several people came along, and then this was their question, not how much poverty is there and how do we get them out of it? The question is, why are most people not poor? Just think of that simple question. Then they started go to the right questions. Well, stronger families, adequate education, extended families they can turn to, nonprofit organizations that offer help. If the government had said, look, we want to help overcome poverty, the government can't just overcome poverty by declaration and spending money. Let's see what government could do to encourage those organizations that are already doing it to help do it. Maybe a more ample support of families, family support, etc. Anyway, that's just an illustration that if you ask the right questions, civil society comes before your eyes. But in too many American eyes, they don't see the institutional character of that. They just see individuals who have done better than other people. I hope that helps.
Alonso, have you got a question here? I'm not too sure exactly if it is a question. You say, I think individual response makes it for real within the community. Sharing is not easy, it is just challenging. Have you got anything to add to that, Alonso? It's not only intention and purpose, it marks the direction of our hearts. He's talking here about sharing, which is a very important part of our polity. Where our polity is the domain in which we are sharing, what would we say, ways of life, or the wealth that we have with others.
Well, and it isn't undifferentiated. Your point. It isn't undifferentiated sharing and caring. It's when you get to the point of saying that the power to enforce, that's the power side in relationship to justice, has the authority to compel, to pay taxes and so forth. When you get that kind of focused, concentrated public justice law, then everybody in the area that the government governs is part of the commons. And therefore, you have to ask, what is it that we share in common? Well, that's a different kind of commons than, let's say, my family. My family commons, we share, but one ill child who may need a lot more investment money-wise, a lot more attention of parents than the other one, related to different kinds of reasons. Different ages will do different things. But the parents, obviously, healthy parents, are looking after the good of the commons, which is, how's the family doing? How is our family growing in health? Not just how are you, how are you, how are you? How do we divvy up things to whatever kid wants or doesn't want? It's what about the commons? And you can talk about any institution like that. But in the case of a political community, it's the public legal commons. And that's where, you think of the air and the water, you think of the court system, if that's for adjudicating disputes. Well, everyone ought to have access to it, not just the wealthy. When you talk about if the government is going to help support education, fund it, which I would say it should from a public legal point of view, for the sake of a healthy, educated commons that no one's left out. It can invest in, it can help direct to, without taking over all the responsibilities of education or anything else. But it's in looking at that we have to come to the idea of a commons. And I would just say one of the great weaknesses in the United States, or those highly influenced by the liberal tradition, is it doesn't begin with any view of the commons. It begins with free individuals accumulating property, wanting protection of their lives and property. A government is established, this is simple lock, to protect lives and liberties. There's no commons to start with. So government is there as a means to other ends, the means to private ends. Because it has to do a whole lot under certain circumstances, it may well be doing things that are good for the commons, but that's not the reason or the argument for it. So again, I think from a Christian plural society viewpoint, we need to be making the arguments for why we need a view of the commons, that even as citizens, you see, we are citizens of the commons. In my family, I'm concerned with family life, as a farmer with my farm, as a teacher with the schooling, as a corporate person with their business. That's perfectly legitimate. And one will want to ask, how are the public laws doing to benefit or harm these institutions? But when I put on my citizenship cap, I should not be asking only, I want government to do something for my family, for my business. I should have my citizen's hat, and I should be asking, how good and healthy is our commons of the things we share together? How just is it? That's the key question to ask.
Mike has a question. He can ask it himself if he wants to. No? It seems then that one explanation that could be given for current protest movements like BLM is the loss of the commons, which privileges the wealthy at the expense of the poor, marginalized.
Well, indeed, on a double count. One is that African Americans were kept out of everything in the commons almost entirely during slavery. And of course, very much prejudiced against after slavery ended, but for another 100 years till civil rights movement, and still there's discrimination, even if much of it is not legal. So in that sense, to get people all under the commons is important. But why the protests, the constant protests? In part, it's because we do not see, most people do not see the political process as one to engage in because they've given up hope that it's going to do something. So instead of organizing a political party, instead of organizing, sometimes they do, sometimes the consequence of their actions will be to get heavily involved in a political party. But we don't have the option of multi-parties here in the United States, given our system. That's a whole nother question. That's a negative too. But if you don't have access to the lawmaking process because others dominate, in this case, white and others, even when it comes to the distribution of funds and other kinds of discrimination, what do? You go out in the street and protest. So protests are strong, but what it leads to quite often is just the opportunity to express yourself, to tell people we're angry, we are upset. And what has to happen is that has to generate itself into, it has to move into the shaping of policy, the shaping of laws. And in this case, I think most of that from the Black Lives Matter movement will go through the Democratic Party. And if it gains the Senate and the presidency, as well as the House this coming election, they might well be able to do all kinds of things and draw in ever more number of people who have color and people who have been discriminated against to be part of the political system.
Right. Mark, have you got something there to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Jim about the issue of mediating structures, because I taught one of my students Bedoyeviert, and I tried to explain it through the lens of the importance of mediating structures. And he then went on to be a secretary to a Liberal MP. And he said to me that he never heard any discussion from any party about the importance of mediating structures. And my question is really very simple. Is the heart of a reformational approach to politics recognizing that mediating structures between the individual and government are really important to encourage and nurture, and that both right-wing and left-wing parties really ignore the importance of mediating structures? Is that like a summary of what you're saying, or have I misunderstood you?
No, that's one good summary. You know, the whole idea of mediating structures, at least in the United States, was developed by Richard John Newhouse and several others that were making the point because they were seeing that the very point that you're making. My slight criticism of it, and we had many discussions with Newhouse, and he appreciated what our arguments were, was that if we look at institutions as only mediating between the individual and the state, then they become mere means to an end. And you could say even families or churches then begin to see themselves as primarily in that political kind of line. So it seemed to me to say what we first need to do, or at bottom, for many people, if they don't even talk about mediating structures, that's a very simple way to get into it and say, pay attention to what people might say is civil society. What I would say to those who have a perspective of the kind who are recognizing the multiple kinds of things is to say, families and schools and all kinds of even political organizations, but media and the rest, they aren't just mediating structures. They have an identity of their own calling and purpose. Yeah. And at the same time, then we need to help them see you do have a public side to you. In other words, your family, your school exists in the public arena not under government, but it's not just an enclosed capsule, self-contained. Or another way to put it is the same people, you and me, are family people, consumers, work at this job, citizens, church members. So in our many caps, wearing our many kinds of responsibility, we need to see that in order that we can fulfill familial and educational and artistic responsibilities, we need to be conscious of how the government is relating to us. But instead of just saying, do more for churches, do more for families, we need to say, do your public duty. And if you want a better, healthier public commons, public order, pay attention to the people who are doing most of the work, the institutions who are carrying out the good of training and so on and so forth. But at a certain level, they become mediating. I just want to emphasize that we should not be thinking of them as only as mediating. Now, there are certain things often associated with civil society organizations that exist specifically for mediation. They are there as to help organize things for a political party, to help address the parliament or the Congress with a message. But, and those are important. They're not governmental, they're non-governmental, but I think there's more to what's in society in that diversity of social things than just those mediating civil institutions.
Mike, can you follow up a question now?
Yeah, thanks. So Mark, I really appreciate the mediating structures. I've mentioned the civil society, and now we're starting to encroach on specifically the institution of the church within society. And you know, one of the things that I've been trying to get my head around is how do we encourage the church to take up its role more confidently in civil society? I don't mean in a kind of neo-Constantinian way, but to, you know, to play their part in society. But one of the things that I'm finding is, and this tends to go kind of conservative liberal, the conservative churches tend to go the individual route, and even to the point of kind of an escapism, like a otherworldly kind of frame, and the churches, maybe you could say on the left, it seems is kind of tied to the structures of the status quo, rather than being a force for reformation or protest or critique or something like that. Like this gets at my frustration, where I feel like the church has bought into the binary that is the problem.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about how to address that, you know, to get the evangelical church to recognize that its gospel message has present and public implication.
Right. Well, two things that come to me in the years. One is if preaching and teaching in the churches would do more to preach God speaking to people there who are his servants in all areas of life. I've been in so many churches. We moved around a lot, Reformed and others, where the teaching, preaching, or even Sunday school and other things are oriented to me as a church member. Hey, we need a new Sunday school teacher. We need to do this, or help us organize our soup kitchen. It's a churchy thing. It's as a church member. But it seems to me that in the preaching, without pastors and others trying to become lawyers and doctors and something else, to say, you who hear this word of the Lord from Job and elsewhere, some of you are doctors in here. Some of you are bankers. Some of you are lawyers. This word is for you. You're a member of the body of Christ in all that you do. You're not just a church member. In fact, I said to my kids when we used to commute a longer distance, I said, we got to quit saying we're going to church this morning. We need to say the church is gathering for worship this morning. So to think of the body of Christ, but then that means that the people in the pews need to hear God is addressing them in all of their capacities. And there are bankers, for example, in a church who ought to be getting together, even if it starts only with that congregation, to say, hey, how are we doing with redlining and renting and how we're dealing? Some of this is not good for the justice of society, and lawyers and others. So if they would do that, it seems to me it would generate people, instead of saying, well, how much can our church do? And then pretty soon pastors or a few elders are worn out. The activists become social gospel activists. Or they only then get uptight about abortion or only about something else, and they can't decide what issues well, the church as an institution isn't a political organization. It shouldn't be trying to ask how many things we can do and then feel good, well, at least we do a soup kitchen, at least we do this. Well, it may be very fine to do it, but it may be just as well to say, let's take up an offering for the great food kitchens downtown or here, and let's get on with our work. What about you people who are teaching? And et cetera, this. And there are many, many passages of scripture that just overlooked from that point of view. People are not, they're not looked at as members of the body of Christ who have civic and other kinds of responsibilities. But then I think if that is done better, you avoid on the one hand this kind of, well, we got to keep the church being focused on its churchy thing, more evangelism, more this, and best wishes at any of you who are citizens. Or on the other hand, the more a church gets involved, and particularly when it's a time of crisis, and it wants to help organize the march and do this and this, it becomes, for many people, that then becomes the mark of the church. If you're simply having your prayer meetings and your Bible studies and not on the march, well, then you're not really a forthright Christian. Well, that's a lie too. So the institution as organization can do so much, but what it should be doing is preaching and teaching and encouraging in a way that lets people become conscious of their responsibilities.
And it would seem to me that you, insofar as you are deepening your understanding of what God requires of us as citizens, this is actually opening up the fact that we have a responsibility to those people that we elect, or those people who are in our local council.
Exactly.
That we actually are there as their resource persons and so on. That it's not a matter of having a theory and applying it. It's a matter of it's not a matter of going to church. It's a matter of being church, I guess.
Yeah.
Being the people of God. Now, wait a minute. Alonzo had a point here. I think that one of the marks of the living church begins early on Monday. He says, well put. And Eliel says, we stop going to the church and we start being the church. I mean,
well, just think of Israel and God's organization of Israel. Israel was not Israel just on the Sabbath day when they were organizing for, offerings and other things. They were Israel, and you read the law, even down to taking their feces outside the gate for health reasons, what they eat and so forth. It's you need to be a people, and you have many responsibilities. That's where you get it. It's not a theory. It's not preaching. It's the way of living. And we need to come to be asking ourselves, are we responding to these calls to do justice? And the reason I come at this thing from a slightly different angle than Roy, while agreeing with the tradition, is if you're looking for a model, a theory, a law framework, then you tend to say, well, here's the framework, and then we apply it to instances. I think it's the other way around. The reason we have a differentiated society in part is because humans were exercising ever more responsibilities, and many of those were not ecclesiastical or political. And so the fight and the struggle, 1,000 years between Rome or the church, that diversifies into two, and you get more. And pretty soon you're struggling to try to get things like constitutions and rights and limited government. Now, once you do that, then you have to give an account of what is unfolding. How are we exercising responsibility? I apologize, folks. my wife went out, and so I'm having to, I can't get away from this phone where I am. Okay.
Mike asks for the reference to the digging stick with the military spears and swords. You have a hole outside and you cover things over. What is that? Deuteronomy somewhere, isn't it?
Call from Martin Kenneth.
Yeah, I don't know where that comes in, Bruce. I mean, I don't know where it is, but yes.
Yeah, it's somewhere there. I'll find it for you, Mike.
Great, or I'll have to search myself.
Mark wants to ask a question about equality.
I've got a friend of mine who lives in a wonderful place called Otley, which is near Leeds. And he sees everything in terms of equality. And I'm sure other people have come across this. And in a sense, I have a sympathy for him, because I think there are things in the Bible that are about wealth distribution, thinking of the year of the Jubilee. How would you respond to someone who in politics sees everything pretty much in terms of equality? I'm thinking about the idea that the government should intervene to promote equality. And so this kind of person is always moaning about our government in the UK is not doing that nearly enough. How would you engage with someone on that kind of issue?
Well, I would get in again to the different kinds of responsibilities people exercise. In other words, I like to start with the family because it's simple, but it's an organization where you'd say, shouldn't everything be equal? I know some couples where they actually have a schedule of taking turns with dishwashing, taking turns with everything, so everything is done equal between the husband and the wife. And then when it comes to kids, well, if you give this one $50, you give this one $50. If you buy a pair of glasses because this kid needs them, the other one should have them, even if they don't need glasses. So the equality in that sense becomes meaningless in an undifferentiated way. If what you say, though, and I think the arguments for equality come down from this commons and the public legal just treatment of everybody, then the civil things is, of course, there ought to be equal treatment under the law. The wealthy shouldn't get away with things. They shouldn't be than the poor. The same thing with if there's going to be educational distribution, it ought to be done to make sure it gets to everybody. If it takes more money to fund a high school student than elementary, then you up the amount. If it takes more to fund handicap education than others, you equal up the amount to get equality. But beyond that kind of distribution of government seeing that there's equal treatment, it can't then simply come around and, I mean, even funding, just think of the difference between somebody who has a job, a position, in which they need relatively little amount of money. They need lots of room for developing and storing things. Or think of the difference between some kind of company that has big capital investments. Well, capital investments requires a different kind of funding. So whatever measure you use, you can't come to pure equality. And then the last thing, of course, is people have different gifts. They have different capabilities. So what it takes for an artist to be an artist, for a scientist to be a scientist, well, certain kind of sciences need big laboratories and they need to be big teamwork. So you have to then take into the different kinds of institutions and relationships. If you've done that, and then say, let me just close, I'm going to go on too long, but Michael Walzer, socialist, so to speak, really, dependent on a Jewish tradition of common thought and sociability. His book, Spheres of Justice, which was not a normative argument, it was presented as a kind of an assessment. But he says many of the things that back a pluralist society. He says, if you want greater equality, the last thing you do is try to shut down the responsibilities of different spheres. Because it's only there that people grow up learning how to do things. At a Christian philosophy conference at Wheaton one time, I heard a guy pleading for why the government ought to require that all churches are willing to hire women into their ministries. And I thought, you know, what a foolish thing to be arguing that every institution has to meet some kind of public legal community. What you will end up is nothing but individuals and a political order. There will be nothing left in the middle, which is part of what we have. So to begin asking, what do you want to talk about equality of? And I think it's mainly in the political sphere, and at that point where you say, look, of all the people that are poor because of racism and discrimination, yes, the racism and discrimination has to be addressed, and if it takes more money to get in there, to improve the transportation in cities to where it gets to where poor people are living, often that's not the case, getting adequate food stores, etc., invest more. But it's not, you're never going to get people who have different energy levels and different capabilities and different responsibilities, everyone coming out just the same on their income tax reports, are all feeling good just because they now make as much money as so-and-so. If that's what, but I'm sure equality means more than that, I'm sure, to him. But it depends on the structure of society.
Well, we've just gone through a period of gender equality, and I find it rather ironic, if not remarkably almost humorous, that in the statistics for COVID-19, they are regularly, the 42 other genders are never mentioned. There's only ever 2 genders that are calculated with the having caught the virus. And I find that really remarkable, because you've got this I don't know what you call it, egalitarianism going mad, which Jordan Peterson was complaining about in Ontario, where you have to give people equal rights with respect to their preferred pronouns and so on, where they self-identify. And so you end up assuming that everybody's got a gender that they're identifying for themselves. It's something that they create out of their own way of life.
It's all part of what grows out of the autonomy claims. In other words, the only laws are the ones we make, and we make them to suit ourselves. So that's self-defeating. The other thing about egalitarianism in that undifferentiated sense is that it's a utopian idea, and the way it's used to come back can only come in critique. It will never end, because it doesn't matter how much equal rights for people, equal protection, there will always be a window on something that somebody thinks is unequal. So it's basically a critique. It's a negation. It's a way of giving me a sense of critical power over against the status quo, instead of a constructive one. The constructive one is really, how do you help people fulfill, exercise responsibilities? Amartya Sen, the economist, when he was addressing basically that kind of question about helping people get more wealth in poor countries, he said it's not more wealth they need, it's the opportunities to exercise responsibilities or to get the capabilities of freedom. And his was a bit narrower, I mean, too narrow even there, because I would say, yes, if what's needed is for all human beings to have the possibility in families and as other institutions as they grow up to find their capabilities, to be encouraged in them so that they can exercise them. Some of us are happy with relatively low income if we just have a chance to teach and read and preach. There are others that can't fulfill a responsibility to build certain kinds of things without big investments, to put ahead of time into building buildings. I don't know what that is, but to an egalitarian theme basically turns people into just, I mean, they can be cardboard figures. They're not real. With all the diversities and characteristics that humans have and all the different kinds of relationships, it just becomes, well, it just washes everything out into a line of wherever a head pops up, well, it's unequal.
We have now gone on for over an hour.
We have,
Uh,
Bruce.
It's quite a surprise to discover what the time is.
I'm just glad to see you didn't fall asleep yet.
I have my ways. Has anybody else got any questions? Well, thank you, Jim, for turning up for us.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I wish that I could we could mingle now and I could actually meet some of you people and shake hands or share a cookie or a coffee or something. But thanks for having me in.